enjoyed it.
Yeah, right. Okay, thank you very much for this introduction, also for the invitation. I've heard about Vermont Law School for many years. I'm delighted to be able to eventually be here and experience what it actually is in all the different facets that one doesn't realize from the outside. Okay, the first thing I should say is that when I was asked for a topic, I saw that there were various international people coming, so I thought maybe I shouldn't insist too much on the international law dimension because you do enough of that around, and then in any case most of my work is in India, so I chose an India-focused topic. Now, having seen the list of the hot topics, what are they called, hot topics, I realize I'm a complete outlier because mostly these are domestic talks you're having, and some of them are international, so I hope I'll try to make the link between the Indian experience and some more international lessons or general lessons that we can learn from what we have in India. But one of the reasons for choosing India is also because for several of the topics I work on, both water and sanitation particularly, it's very difficult to say things that are specific enough if we don't look at national experiences. So the international, we can link whatever is in the questions in a while. We can link whatever I have to say to the international legal developments, law and policy developments. But I guess it's very difficult to say the kind of specific things one can say about a country if one doesn't look at the local situation. So that's the framework, but in a sense, if I understand that probably most people don't work on India, India may not be your country of focus, but I guess there are many lessons we can learn from looking at a specific country, even though it's just one out of many examples one may have. Now, second thing is probably also sanitation per se. That's not yet a very hot topic per se, so I know this is a hot topic lecture series. So I thought I should just try by explaining a little bit as to why it is that sanitation is something we should all, in a sense, be integrating into the kind of work we do. There are things that I guess we all know instinctively or from the readings we've done in terms of the links we make between sanitation and other things we look at. The first is health. It's well known that waterborne diseases throughout the world are largely linked to inappropriate sanitation, and waterborne diseases are one of the serious health challenges we face around the world. So that's fine. The health component is very well known. It's very well enshrined in whatever sanitation policies we may have. But as I guess I'll show a little bit later, in fact, in practice, the health dimension really disappears besides focus on infrastructure, largely. That's what it is. I suspect we don't know that. Secondly, there is a link with water. I'll get back to that in a minute. Water and sanitation are basically one and the same thing for many people, sanitation being an add-on to the water discourse. So it's very clear that we know that water and sanitation are linked. Maybe the one specific point I can highlight here is that black water, which is, as opposed to that distinction between grey water, which is what comes out of sinks and showers, and black water, which is what comes out of toilets. Black water is obviously a very important component of any water quality discourse we may want to have, among various other water issues that may arise. Thirdly is the environmental dimension. Now, here it's also very clear, I'm sure, especially to all of us here, wastewater treatment, water recycling, all of that is a very important environmental issue. What's usually not understood or integrated into our thinking is that it's actually a sanitation issue. That doesn't mean that it's not an environmental issue, but it's definitely very much also a sanitation issue. And all these components, wastewater for instance, and that's specifically the case for India that I'm looking at, wastewater is treated exclusively as an environmental issue for now. So the link with sanitation is actually not. That's four dimensions that we all would easily identify as being part of a sanitation discourse. There are two other preliminary things I want to highlight which are really central to the more specific case study I have for India, but which would be valid to a certain extent in many other countries as well. One I've put as equality. I couldn't find a more generic term to use. Gender is a major concern in terms of sanitation policies. I'll come back to that at one specific focal point that I want to take here. And secondly, there is also social discrimination aspect. That's also another very significant thing, particularly in India, and that's one key aspect of the legal regime. But that's something that we don't tend to associate with sanitation per se, in general terms, and that's something which also largely disappears or is under the surface in international legal debates around the right of sanitation. Second thing is labor rights. Labor rights generally apply obviously to sanitation, but it's very interesting that in the context of sanitation discourses, there is hardly any focus on the right of sanitation workers, even though there are specific issues that arise, partly linked to the discrimination problem that I will also highlight in a minute. Now, why is India an important or a good case study for sanitation? Well, it happens to have to be the country with the highest number of people practicing open defecation as of now. Okay, so nearly 600 million, which is about 60% of the worldwide figure. So it's really the case study in terms of a country where people largely don't have access to toilets as of now. And okay, 600 million is a bit less than half the population, which is about 1 billion and 1.1 billion people. On the whole, in India, it's about only 36% of the population that has access to improved sanitation. These figures have to be taken with a pinch of salt because in my empirical data, which is not data at all, but empirical experience, wherever you go, whichever village you go, whether you've been told that this is a village which is 100% open defecation free or not, the reality is not what you're told and what must be reflected in those figures. So likely it's actually a lot more, a lot less access to improved sanitation than what we see in the figures. Secondly, in terms of storage, there's only about 30% of urban households have access to the sewage system, which means that all the rest goes wherever it can go, in drains, in rivers directly. In rural areas, there is no sewage system to speak of. So we are really in a completely different framework. Wastewater, again, these figures are really estimates, so don't take them, they're very specific because that's what I found, but they are just estimates because nobody actually knows. 30% of wastewater is let into the environment without any treatment, but the thing is that doesn't count the wastewater treatment plants which don't function at full capacity, of which there are many in the two biggest cities, which are Delhi and Bombay, which account for most of the waste treatment plant capacity in the country. So there are largely significant uncertainties in those figures. Now, interestingly, 60% of water pollution is caused by sewage. And that again is very interesting because water pollution has been understood since the 1970s as an environmental issue. And to date, it's very difficult for environmentalists, environmental lawyers, whoever they are, whoever is dealing with something called environment, to understand that yes, it's an environmental issue, but it has to be linked to sanitation policies if something serious is to be done about the cause of the pollution. As far as health is concerned, so it's 1/5 of diseases are waterborne diseases. That's a huge segment, something that needs to be addressed, obviously, with that again. And I know it's nothing new, but just to put some content to the ideas we have. Now, the last thing I've put in terms of background is the number of dry latrines. So dry latrines, that may be a concept that not all of us are familiar with. These are latrines which basically are just a slab of stone where there is no evacuation mechanism. There has to be someone who comes and scoop it out physically. So hence there is a problem of physical contact with human excreta. As of now, or as of a couple of years ago, there were at least still 700,000 people employed as so-called manual scavengers. So manual scavengers as the people, that's a jargon terms in India in a sense, for people whose job is to clean those dry latrines. I'll come back to that. Now, what is sanitation in the law and policy framework in India? There's been a lot of progress in the sense that the definitions that are given to us by policy documents have improved or have broadened over time quite a lot. So the definition we had as of 2012 basically talks about the various components we might think of: personal hygiene, sanitation in the home, safe water disposal, garbage disposal, which means that it's solid and liquid waste that we're talking about. That's very important, so I don't want to insist too much on this today, but we really can't talk about only liquid waste or only solid waste separately, which is what we tend to do. And it also talks about wastewater disposal, so something that seems to make sense, and that's very important, but I guess, as I'll show, that's not quite what we see in practice. Okay, so there are all these different dimensions of sanitation that are recognized. In practice, however, and that's true in most countries of the South, what we really have is something called, that in jargon terms is known as the water sector, in other words, watt for water and san for sanitation. And this acronym really represents what we're talking about. An extremely strong integration of the fields of water and sanitation to the extent that one cannot be considered without the other. That's particular. It's not true in the context of water, because water can very much be considered separately, but what this means is that sanitation never gets to be considered separately from water. And interestingly, just to make one link back to the international level, indeed, at the international level, UN member states have relatively steadfastly refused until now to recognize a human right to sanitation that's separate from the human right to water. And if you look at UN documents, all of them will tell you that there is a human right to water and sanitation, not human rights to water and sanitation, or whichever other formulation. So that's definitely a first major issue, which is very visible in India, which is very visible throughout the world. That despite the fact that we have a broad definition of sanitation, in practice, the real link is all to do with water. Now, the problem, one problem that we can identify very clearly in India is the fact that there are other issues that need to be addressed, other fundamental issues, not just general issues, but fundamental issues. Manual scavenging is one of them. I'll come back to it in a minute more. Another aspect is violence against women, so it's part of the gender dimension, but it's just one specific aspect which I won't cover again later. Violence against women is basically something which is linked to open defecation. Open defecation for women largely means that women have to wait until darkness has set to go out. Under the cover of darkness, there are also lots of men who have better things to do than walk and go home. There are a number of cases every year of rape and other forms of violence against women, which are obviously not due to open defecation, but which are linked to open defecation, because open defecation, for social reasons, has to happen under the cover of darkness. There's no legal framework there, but there are legal consequences to it. Now the problem, and that we've seen, there are many judgments over time relating to violence against women linked to open defecation. They never make the link with sanitation. They're always taken as a criminal offense, which the criminal offense is there. That's not the point is not to deny that. But the fact is that's not linked to the underlying problem of open defecation. So, in other words, there's a clear framework at some level which is defined in the policy framework, but behind that there are lots of other issues which either are not acknowledged as being part of sanitation. That's the case for both manual scavenging, even though it's obvious that it's actually sanitation, and violence against women, issues that definitely need to be also addressed here. Now, what is it that we have in the legal framework? We have, and that makes our life easy in terms of looking at it from a legal perspective, we have a clear right to sanitation that's been recognized by the Supreme Court of India, even though there is no mention of sanitation or right to sanitation in the Constitution. Like in various other cases, and that's something which often we know concerning India through the public interest litigation studies that we may do. All these rights that have been recognized over the past couple of decades, environment, water, sanitation, have all been derived from the right to life. So it's a derived right which is linked directly to life. Now, here I've just highlighted one of the first cases where the right to sanitation itself was recognized by the Supreme Court. What's interesting is that this was done in the context of looking at municipal infrastructure, municipal planning. In other words, that could tend to give us a sense that there is a broad understanding of what sanitation is, not just access to toilets to restrict open defecation. On the whole, I guess to limit this discussion, as a judicial-led intervention, the right to sanitation, the fundamental right to sanitation is very well enshrined in the legal framework, but what we're missing is the links further down in legislation, in regulation, in policy instruments. I'll get back to it in a minute. What else is there in the Constitution at the constitutional level? So, in other words, on the one hand, we have a right to sanitation, which has the same shape and feel as what we see at the international level, which was recognized very early on by the Supreme Court. Yeah, I should have noticed that on the previous slide. 1994, that's quite a lot before major international debates started on the right to sanitation. In that sense, India was ahead of debates at the international level. It's not necessarily ahead in terms of implementation of the right, but in terms of the recognition at that highest level, it was quite ahead of its time. Now, what else do we have in the Constitution? So, as I mentioned, there is no mention of sanitation, but there are other rights, other fundamental rights which are relevant. The one I'll focus on is the one which relates to manual scavenging. So, Article 17 has nothing to do with sanitation per se. It talks about untouchability, which is about that one of these very deep social issues that India faces. That's not, I don't want to focus on that here, and that's not my expertise. Basically, the basis of the caste system, whereby some people, the lowest of the low, were deemed to be untouchable. As part of the movement towards independence from colonization, one of the things that was strongly pushed was a move to ban untouchability as being one of the most serious social issues that India was facing, and the Constitution recognized that in 1950. Now, one of the, untouchability is a broad, very broad issue, but within that, one of the important elements of the justification for untouchability is very much the actual dirt. And the dirt is linked to the occupation of some people, not all of them, but some people that helps justifying it, people who are the manual scavengers. So very much making untouchability, prohibiting untouchability is in itself prohibiting manual scavenging in the context in which it is understood. So that's something that's been very much enshrined strongly in the legal frameworks in 1950. As I mentioned earlier, we still have around 700,000 manual scavengers in the country. So something didn't quite work out in the meantime. To show the kind of resistance, that's really a summary, but it so happens that I can show it to you in legal terms, so the kind of resistance to the implementation of this Article 17. We have two central legislation plus one Supreme Court judgment that have had to come on top of the constitutional prohibition to make things move forward. So first in 1993, there was legislation that was passed to push the agenda forward because it was recognized that not enough or very little had been done. In 2004, a case was filed by an organization working for the liberation of manual scavengers because the 1993 Act was not being implemented sufficiently well. That led eventually to the government taking the initiative to adopt another act in 2013 and the Supreme Court making strong
giving a relatively strong judgment in 2014. So in a sense, there's been a lot of legal attention to the issue of manual scavenging. There are good reasons, again, because it's one of these very deep social issues that agitates, in a sense, the whole anti-caste movement in India. But what we are seeing is that this is a core sanitation issue that has not been addressed in terms of sanitation and does not feature within the discourse on the right to sanitation. So that's something very interesting, because there's a complete dichotomy between these very intricate, in a sense, legal frameworks that we have by now, all levels of the highest bodies, as in parliament, national parliament, even though sanitation is a state issue. So it's not a national issue, so in principle that's not parliament's business, and the Supreme Court coming into it. Now, one of the reasons why there's been progress, and I should just highlight that in terms of the way the legal framework functions, is not just because society has evolved, but because that movement, which I've put the name in Hindi, the Safai Karamchari Andolan, which is the movement for the eradication of manual scavenging, for the past 20 years has been the force behind pushing the government at all levels to do something. So it hasn't happened just because the legal framework has reacted to some things. There's been a very strong push from behind. It's one of those issues. There are many other examples in India where movements, social movements, have managed to make the legal framework move forward, which doesn't yet mean that the implementation and the enforcement is satisfactory, but very significant things have happened. Now, going back to sanitation as we more normally understand it, right to sanitation, which starts from toilets in a sense. Firstly, as opposed to this whole slide I had before where I could show you two national pieces of legislation, for sanitation in general, there is no legislation that addresses sanitation per se, either at the state level or at the national level. What we have is in local laws, which are usually state level, but which may also be at the municipal level. There is a focus on drainage and sewerage in terms of the responsibilities of these local bodies and what they have to do if they're doing something concerning sanitation in terms of the broad infrastructure. But there is nothing in those local laws that talks about building individual toilets, building community toilets, building public toilets. None of that. It's really just about the infrastructure and understood as part of the broader municipal infrastructure that the municipalities have to look after. Okay, so that's one thing that we have. So there is consideration of sanitation somewhere in the legal framework, but it's in very operational terms. It doesn't link at all, in no way, to that broad human right or fundamental right to sanitation recognized by the Supreme Court. Secondly, we have pollution control laws, so they're relatively strong, but again, they are environmental laws. So they look at the issue of water pollution from the perspective of the environment without making the link. And that's one of the gaps that needs to be filled. Thirdly, there is a movement towards regulating water recycling, water reuse, rainwater harvesting. All of these things have been set in movement, so there are links with sanitation, but these links again are not acknowledged. So on the whole, there is a lack of regulation of sanitation. So in other words, the legal framework is not there, is not sufficient to answer the call that, if we see that as a call that the Supreme Court has put out in terms of doing something with regard to implementing a fundamental right to sanitation. Now, sanitation has become a big issue over the past few decades, so it's not like nothing has happened in practice. And that's true both in the context of water and in the context of sanitation. What the central government has done, mostly, so again, it's a central government that takes the initiative, even though it's not its responsibility, because it should be the states that take the initiative with regard to both water and sanitation. So the central government has taken the initiative, partly because there's been external funding for that, partly because there's been policy developments at international level, such as the Millennium Development Goals, calling on all countries to reduce, for instance, open defecation by half in the past 15 years. So definitely these have been elements that have prodded the government into being more and more active in the context of sanitation. There's been various iterations of the policy framework starting from 1986, so that's much before MDGs. MDGs have just added some pressure on it. And there's been frequent, if not regular, changes in the policy framework. So the last one we have now, it's called the Clean India Mission that was started some 6 months ago. A brand new policy framework. So if you look just at the cover, you will feel that there is something drastically new that has happened. In effect, it's just repackaging the previous policy framework that was of 2012, which itself recycled or repackaged the one from 2011, 2010, 2007. Okay, and I won't go into the details. But basically, the policy framework keeps evolving. The problem is that there is no participation, because there is no mechanism for participation in the evolution of this policy framework, unlike with legislation where there is a very well laid out procedure that allows for democratic participation in the way in which the democracy that functions in India provides. So again, that's not going into the what functions and what doesn't function in terms of the democracy in India, but the framework is there for many things. It works very well. The problem here is that things are not happening according to the framework that exists. In other words, there is a little bit of bypassing of the existing avenues. Now, what is the problem with this policy framework at present is that it's overwhelmingly focused on building individual toilets and making sure that people use those toilets, which is known as behavior change, as in the push for behavior change. That's all very good, as in that's one of the issues that needs to be taken up, but it's the same policy framework with definition I was giving at first, which in principle is broad, looks after wastewater treatment, for instance, and various other issues. So the practice of it, which in effect is the implementation of the right to sanitation, is much, much narrower in terms of specifically individual toilets, which we may see partly, but it's not just that, as a reaction to the MDGs and the need to eliminate open defecation. That's only one of the explanations we can give for that focus. Now, what are the implications of the current policy framework we have? Which in effect, again, it's a policy framework, but because there is no legislative framework to back it up, it acts as the legal framework in practice. But you can't go to court. There are no rights arising from that, because these are executive instruments from the executive. Firstly, and most visibly, there is no right to sanitation mentioned in any of these policy frameworks. So sanitation is there, it's about sanitation, but there is no link made with what the Supreme Court and the higher judiciary in general has had to say. So we have a big dichotomy between what we as lawyers may understand in terms of what the legal framework says in India and what actually happens on the ground. The problem is that all the people who implement that policy framework, all they rely on is the government's documents. They don't have the time, and they haven't been given access to Supreme Court judgment X, Y, or Z. What they know is what they see in the policy framework. So if the policy framework doesn't provide the link, it will not happen. It will not go down further in terms of implementation. Secondly, the right, if there is any right that's actually being implemented, is definitely a right to a toilet, not a right to sanitation. That's the big issue. The way in which it's implemented, or the way in which there is content which is given to this right, is by giving incentives, because they're not called subsidies. For the past 15 years, they have not been called subsidies, they're called incentives, but in effect, they're subsidies, to individuals. This has been a huge drain on the exchequer in a way, because the money given is not enough to build toilets, so the very poor cannot actually build toilets with the amount given. So regularly there is a demand for more money to be given. At the same time, the more money there is flowing into the system, the more there are opportunities and ideas that may be given to certain people to use the system for diverting the money. So we have both things happening at the same time. The more money there is into the system, the more the toilets inappropriate toilets can be built, because it's never enough. It's regularly more, but it's never quite enough to build a full toilet. And at the same time, the more money that's flowing in, the more there are opportunities for siphoning out some of it. Second point that's laid out in the policy framework is to say that there should be encouragement to use the toilets that are built, because that's a big issue. There are lots of toilets which are built but which are not used. And one of the things which is done is through sanctions. And there is one way in which sanction is actually in terms of fines. These fines seem to be never implemented because it's impossible for people at the local level to actually fine each other for open defecation. But these are things that are actually written down in some local level instrument. That's relatively very strange from the point of view of a fundamental right. The way to implement a fundamental right to something which looks like a sanction. Okay, so what's the result of this policy framework? I didn't bring too many pictures because I know sanitation is not a picturesque topic, but just to give you a sense of what we are talking about. Incomplete structures, but that definitely counts as a toilet in official documents, and incomplete structures and completed or partly completed structures which are not used because people are not ready to use them. It may be fully functional on the right, but people are not ready to use it. So that's one of the outcomes of this policy. Now, one specific point I want to focus on is the gender dimension. Now, a large part of the campaign is linked to that behavioral change and the way in which people are told that they should move towards using toilets is to say that it's not good for women to walk out under the cover of darkness, some things that per se we would probably all agree with in general. Now, since I'm running short of time, I won't show you that the 40-second video I had, which is lighter than the pictures I just showed you, which is basically an ad, a UNICEF-sponsored act, which shows the fact that the campaign is centered around women being told not to accept living in a household where there is no toilet, because that diminishes the honor, the pride of the household if bathed women, and that's where the crux of the issue comes in a sense, have to go out to defecate. Now, so the problem here is that under the cover of helping women not having to go out, what's being done, particularly in some of the northern states, okay, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, some of the central northern Hindi-speaking states, where women are largely asked to stay home and also made to cover in front of strangers. The message which is being given is to say that you are not allowing your women to go out and you want them to be safe and sound at home, hence you should build toilets. In other words, not questioning the very framework which is extremely problematic from a gender equality perspective, but rather reinforcing it. And interestingly, even a collector who is the highest person, higher administrative person at the district level, which is a unit just below a state, a lady collector that I talked to a few months ago, so a lady who should understand the issue, clearly acknowledged, obviously off the record, but clearly acknowledged that yes, we know it's not good for women's situation generally, but we have to push that sanitation agenda, and for now that's what matters, so we are doing it. So under the guise of short-term gains, there are very negative consequences, long-term consequences in terms of gender equality which arise in terms of sanitation policy. So that again, I know these are sanitation issues which don't sound like they're sanitation, but if the two things are not looked at together, there is no way in which we can have progressive sanitation policies that actually make a contribution for human rights generally. And what's actually significant here is that the human right to sanitation is a derived right from the right to life, so is the right to water, so are many other rights. In other words, we know from a legal perspective that it's not possible to look at the rights separately from other rights. It has to be looked at separately because it has its separate specific components, but it also needs to be looked at in a broader context, which is really not happening. Now, okay, what are the broader challenges we face and what are the lessons we can learn? In a context where the law is underdeveloped, there is very little accountability of the duty holders, so the state in general, and there is limited actual content to the right. So the only content we can identify to the right to sanitation is in effect that right to an individual toilet, which doesn't answer most of the other questions we have with regard to sanitation. The repeatedly changing policy framework, so that's repeating what I've already said, is problematic because it doesn't give people an opportunity to engage with the policy changes that occur. Policy changes just occur at some point without anyone having had notice of them, apart from a few selected people. The experts always in the know, but we're not talking about experts. Now, where there is law, which is the case with manual scavenging, implementation and enforcement has been a significant problem. So that kind of confirms that sanitation is still, it's not anymore taboo in the way it was a couple of decades ago, but it's still a very difficult topic to address at various levels. There may be willingness to push at the highest level, MPs may be willing to address the topics. That doesn't mean that that willingness extends to the people who have to implement those laws. And in fact, at all sorts of levels, there is dragging of feet which happens. And the last point I've put is just to remind ourselves also that it's not just a question of the government, of what the courts do, what the officials do, it's also a question of classroom experience where sanitation is not discussed. Again, it was because of taboo type, we don't discuss dirty topics. But it's still the case because there is no scholarship, there is no engagement with the issue, hence it remains a topic which is somewhere out there. We know it's important, but we're not actually addressing it in terms of teaching, in terms of research. Now, what are the lessons we can learn? To start the conversation, maybe the questions. Sanitation has to be considered as a separate topic because there are dimensions which are not linked to water. So it's particularly evident in India with that issue of manual scavenging, but it's true everywhere and should be recognized both in all countries and at international level, again, something that hasn't been done yet. Now, what is the problem with the focus on individual toilets? Basically, that means we are avoiding the harder, more complex discussion about wastewater treatment, sewerage. And even though it's never said openly, it's clear that it's a question of the state not being willing to invest in the necessary infrastructure to ensure that the toilets connect with a system that will actually make up a whole comprehensive framework. So, in a sense, what we often seem to be ending up with is a displacement of the risk, the health risk, for instance, rather than a reduction of the risk. And that's true, and that's acknowledged in many individual cases. I don't have overall figures, and nobody seems to have done that research. Maybe it's impossible to do as well. There are lots of, since groundwater is the main source, the overwhelming main source of water for people in India, there is definitely a link between the badly built toilets and seepage into the ground. That's acknowledged in various specific cases, but as to what the actual consequences are, we have no idea. We just know that there are likely consequences in various places. So there is really a risk of just transferring the risk from one place to another rather than reducing it if we don't look at sanitation in a comprehensive manner. Finally, the right to sanitation doesn't have to be equated only with the right of access to individual toilets, even in terms of the toilet component. There are various places where individual toilets may not be the best or the appropriate solution. So there's been, and that's very much linked to the policy inputs and the international policy frameworks that we have. There's been a lot of emphasis on individual toilets at the expense of other solutions that may be appropriate. Now, in legal terms, what we need, and that's true for many other human rights, it's not just the case for sanitation, what we need is human rights that are enshrined in legal framework, not just in those apex level judgments which makes us feel very good, but which do not actually translate into anything concrete on the ground. The problem is also that if there is no integration in the legal framework, the courts are the only recourse you can have if you have a rights-related issue. The courts in this country, as well as in most other countries, particularly in India, because the inequalities are probably high in that sense, are not accessible for everyone on a daily basis. Just reminders that as far as the higher judiciary is concerned, it's all in English, it's not in local languages, so that's one immediate barrier to access to courts. The right discourse, if it is there, must be expanded to look at sanitation workers, for instance, manual scavenging sanitation workers, rather than addressing it as a separate rights issue. So it's again that idea that we have different human rights or different rights that are concerned, but they're not looked at from a broad perspective. And finally, I guess the main thing that's happening on the ground is a focus on infrastructure as an answer to a call for the implementation of right to sanitation. Infrastructure is part of the answer, but it cannot be the answer, which is what we seem to be having for now in practice. Even though the policy framework obviously says a lot more than that, so I'm not trying to say that the policy framework doesn't recognize other things, and even that in practice there are no other things happening, but the primary impact that we can actually identify is really that infrastructure, that built-in component. I'll stop here so that there is enough time for discussion.
Questions? Professor Cullet.
Philippe, thank you. It's hugely important. It's hugely difficult. I've got a lot of questions. Let me sort of ask just a big question. Is this fundamentally really even a legal issue? And what I mean by that is that you've got a lot of examples where you've got laws in the books, you've got Supreme Court judgments, they're not implemented, they're not resourced. And I guess I'm somewhat skeptical of the rights-based approach if you don't have social norms or some kind of sort of grassroots or lower level sort of fundamental support of this. I mean, otherwise you get a right without a remedy. And so I guess the question I ask is, it's a much bigger social question whether law leads or law follows. But it seems to be sort of saying two things. You're saying on the one hand, the laws we've got are not being implemented effectively, so we need basically a law that says it's a human right to sanitation. And I don't see how you can square those two.
No, okay. Yes, in trying to pack everything together, probably I'm leading to that kind of reaction. Okay, very much the right without a remedy is an issue. Rights-based approaches in India, like in many other countries, have the detractors. What we see is that if we didn't have the rights-based approach, we would have even bigger gaps in the fulfillment of the basic principles of the Constitution, let's say, just to put it at that very broad level. So one example, but that's one of the issues. For sanitation, the only social movement that exists and that uses that rights-based approach is that movement for the eradication of manual scavenging. And they have been extremely successful. Without them, there would, okay, I have no idea, but maybe there would have been 10% or 50 or whatever it may be, of the advances that have taken place over the past 20, because they've been around for the past 20 years or so. There are other issues where, because it's so fragmented, there is no understanding that it's something which applies to your neighbor, to your second neighbor, and to your neighbors 100 kilometers away. And as a result, it doesn't translate into anything where the law might actually be used and useful. But for India in general, I would say that the rights-based approach is still a boon, because there are lots of issues where people have been able to use the legal framework and the rights-based approach to very good effect. The problem is that there should be many more such movements and people using it. It's a question of not enough resources, as in human, financial resources, to be able to force the system to react and do what we assume it should be doing. So fine, it's too much law on the one hand, it's not enough law on the other. It's a question of people having to push the system so that it does what it's expected to do.
Okay.
I don't know who is.
You call on me first.
So this is going to be kind of a complicated question, but I did some research a long time ago on biogas in India and trying to address the wood collection problem with the rural women in particular, with access to a cooking fuel that didn't pollute the indoor air quality. So I'm wondering if are there any connections to this issue with connecting the need in the rural areas in particular with a heat source, a cooking source? Or are there just the barriers would be too great using human waste versus cow dung?
Well, there are attempts to do that, but in India there is that big issue which needs to be taken into account. Anything which involves handling human excreta manually is out of question. And in fact, there was a blunder a few years ago by international policy agencies that suggested a new form of ecological sanitation, which in effect was kind of going back to dry latrines in an indirect way. Given what I've highlighted, the immense struggle that it's been to move towards the implementation of that prohibition of untouchability, there are certain things which may be technologically interesting and which may be done in other countries which cannot be implemented in India, at least not for the next few decades until the social structure has evolved sufficiently. For now, it's too close to, again, it hasn't been eradicated yet, so we can't move back. So, much more.
So in the urban areas, I'm wondering if this could be addressed by focusing on government infrastructure and building sewage pipes that connect to the buildings, because I'm imagining all sorts of unconnected buildings. You know, it seems like this is such a massive infrastructure issue that isn't there an engineering solution to it that could also tie into Shannon's point about biogas. It wouldn't be related to human handling of it, but if you design the sewage treatment plants to capture biogas using technology, that wouldn't involve human scavengers.
Okay, there are definitely initiatives. It will take a lot of time, but there are initiatives that have been set into motion. Okay, one of them, it's not urban per se, but one of them is in the railways. The railways have been the biggest employer of manual scavengers for a long time, including basically up to now. The railways are government owned, so that's obviously a problem in terms of constitutional prohibition. So the railways have eventually, over the past few years, but only because of a lot of pressure from the movements and from the courts, moved towards trying to have some form of sanitation, which allows for not touching the human excreta. So in other words, there is decomposition before it's actually handled by anyone. So there are attempts to move towards that. There are also attempts in terms of building, so that's for urban areas, to move towards dual piping for recycling grey water to ensure that there is less wastewater that needs to be treated. That's already started, that there is quite a bit which is being done, but a lot more needs to be done. And it will take a lot of time. Beyond that, major investments in wastewater treatments have to be made and are being made. It's just that it's starting from an extremely low base, so it will take a lot of time until okay, typically in Delhi you don't see the Yamuna, which is the river that goes through Delhi, being completely black downstream of the city.
So, obviously this is not an exclusive problem to India, Indians, or this particular place in time. This is a problem that every human settlement from the beginning of time has dealt with. And back to the question of whether the law leads or follows, I can't imagine that it was ever conquered or settled or achieved by setting a law, constitutional guideline, what have you, that it's a function of poverty. It's a function of not having options or not even being aware of those options. So poverty and education. And so trying to lead by mandating toilets and pipes and switches and lights, there will always be gaps and there will always be non-compliance because there's no incentive, and the incentive is you can't pressure people to use toilets. People want to use toilets. And the way they want to use toilets, they can afford to use them. So I guess I'm going back to the fact that I really think that the emphasis on legislation and rules is misplaced in that economic growth is about the only thing that will solve this problem. And I realize it's chicken and egg and I'm sounding like a right-wing guy, but I don't get how writing laws for illiterates helps get them to comply, except if you're going to run a police state.
Okay, there is definitely a poverty dimension in the wealthier parts of the country. The wealthier household build toilets for themselves because it's part of social status and things like that, and because they can afford it. But if we leave it to economic growth to do the job, we might still be here in a few decades.
You're still going to be there in 2 decades. So you're not cutting any time out by writing law.
No, that's not completely true, because that behavioral change doesn't work completely, but it does work to an extent.
Okay.
The problem is that the targets that are given, sometimes they come from UNICEF or the World Bank, sometimes directly from the central government, are completely unrealistic. Suddenly, in the next 6 months, we need that whole district to be open defecation free. That just cannot happen. Certain collectors, for instance, in that village, in 15 days, we built all the toilets in all the houses. That kind of system will not be successful, that's for sure. But on the whole, there is improvement. People very much understand. Once they understand the health dimension, they very much want to shift to using toilets as well. There's an age dimension to that. Older people will not shift. That's okay. So there's a generational dimension, but it may take 10 years rather than take 1 day. That's fine. But the change is ongoing.
Can I follow up real quick?
Can you follow up after, because people have to, I think we really need to.
Okay.
So maybe we can continue the conversation individually, but I wanted to thank Philippe and to thank everyone for coming. I'm sorry we have to cut off the conversation short, but I know people have to get places by 1 o'clock, so we need to stop. But thank you.
Okay.